just hit the record button now. Sorry about that. Embarking on new and exciting ways to build relationships is vital to our evolution as an institution. You, our alumni and friends, are our greatest ambassadors. You are a worldwide community of professionals, leaders, and change makers who advance the reputation of our university, our province, and our world. Please consider getting involved with our programming. There are mentoring opportunities with 10,000 coffees, occasions to meet up with Newfoundland and Labrador expats through Global NL, and Coastlines, our online book club, features Newfoundland and Labrador authors who are also Memorial alumni. You can find more details about all these initiatives on our website, which is www.mun.ca/alumni. Thank you so much for joining us at this event today. HSS 101 is designed to introduce Memorial alumni and friends, whether they work in business, science, economics, or anything in between, to disciplines in the social sciences and humanities that offer insight on the evolution of human knowledge, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. I'll also be monitoring the Q&A function that you see on your screen. If you'd like to ask a question, you can type it in there. Please try to use the Q&A function rather than the chat, but I'll be checking both. Dr. D'Arcangelis and Dr. Hallet will answer as many questions as possible following their presentation. And please keep your questions short, under 250 characters. This session is now being recorded, and you're going to receive a link in an email after the event to the event on YouTube if you'd like to watch it again. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce our two guests today. Dr. D'Arcangelis is a late bloomer to academia and motherhood, and she says she still cannot decide which job is harder. She was raised a white settler on Kanyen'kehà territory in upstate New York, but cut her feminist teeth years later working for the United Nations in Guatemala with Indigenous women. She also has a BA from Harvard and an MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. Her research interests include Indigenous feminisms, post-colonial feminisms, settler colonial studies, solidarity alliances, critical race theory, social movements, critiques of modernity. Dr. D'Arcangelis's book on the subject of solidarity between Indigenous women and white women in the contemporary Canadian context will be published by the University of British Columbia Press within the next academic year. Over to Dr. Hallet. Dr. Hallet is a trained scuba diver who grew up in Mount Pearl, Newfoundland, and she has always loved studying literature, history, cultural studies, current events, politics, and feminism. She considers gender studies to be a place where the currents of her interdisciplinary interests meet and thrive, in the same way that cold and warm ocean currents meet, combine, and create perfect conditions for life to bloom. Dr. Hallet has a BA and MA from Memorial, so she as well is an alumnus, and a PhD from York University, and her research interests include women in Newfoundland and Labrador, life writing as connected to identity and place, feminist post-colonial theory, and autoethnography. In 2018, Dr. Hallet published Mistress of the Blue Castle, The Writing Life of Phoebe Florence Miller, which was shortlisted for the 2019 Newfoundland and Labrador Book Award for Nonfiction. It was also called a significant contribution to the study of Newfoundland culture by poet and professor Mary Dalton. And I'm happy to tell you that courtesy of Iser Books, we have 3 copies of Dr. Hallet's book that we are going to be sending to 3 randomly selected attendees, but you have to ask a question to be eligible to win a copy of the book. So we sort of have a door prize, but no door. So I'm going to turn the screen over to Dr. D'Arcangelis and Dr. Hallet now, and they will begin their presentation. So I'm just going to change it over to the presentation. 1 second, people. And I'm going to get rid of myself right now, and I'm going to mute.
Okay, thank you so much, Janet, and thank you to everyone who is here with us in cyberspace today. Okay, so Gender Studies 101, here we go. Who are we? What do we do? Where can you find us? So if you go to Memorial University's website and then search up Gender Studies, you'll come across our webpage. And there you'll see the following blurb, which tells you about what we offer, which is the opportunity to explore gender in society. And Gender Studies addresses gender and gender relations and practical tools for promoting equality. And this is the blurb you'll see when you go there. In addition to that, I will give you my really sort of brief elevator speech, which I give when someone asks what I do. And then that is usually quickly followed by, what is gender studies? At which point I will say something along the lines of, it's the study of the social world through a feminist lens. And this lens engages with what gender is, what it does, and how it matters to all of us, regardless of how we identify. And in this way, I think gender studies is able to discuss the shifting power dynamics at play in society, past, present, and towards the future. And so usually at this point in the conversation I'm having, the person will nod and then slowly back away to go refresh their drink. But you've signed up, and so you're here for the duration. So you're going to get a much longer version of this, and we're going to get into some of the key concepts and ideas that we work with on a regular basis. And so next in line, of course, is Lynne D'Arcangelis, who my dear colleague, who will talk about another key aspect of gender studies.
Okay, thank you so much, Vicky. I'm not sure if people can see me. My camera wasn't
I can
working.
still see you.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So one key concept that we'd like to convey to talk about gender studies is the concept of interdisciplinarity. So yes, gender studies is a discipline, but it draws on so many existing disciplines, right? It's a relatively new discipline. So most women and gender studies departments, for example, were established in the in the 1970s and then onward, right? They were called women's studies, and then over time the names changed to include gender studies. And so I looked to Wikipedia, which I caution my students actually not to do, but Wikipedia's gotten a lot better over time. That's what I told my colleagues. So it says, interdisciplinarity is about creating something by thinking across boundaries. And I would say that's really what we do. And this is reflected in our faculty profiles. For example, Dr. Hallet does have a degree, a PhD in women and gender studies, but I don't. I have a degree in adult education and community development, right, in a school of education. Dr. Sonia Boone has a bachelor's and a master's in music. Jennifer Dyer, who some of you might know, has a master's of philosophy and a PhD in cultural analysis. Giovanna Del Negro has a PhD in folklore, and then Christina Doonan has a PhD in political science. So you can see right there that even in our faculty, in our department, we're engaged in working across disciplines. So I think I'll leave it there, Vicky, unless you want to add something.
No, I think that's a really great explanation. And I think it's a real strength of gender studies that I think we do draw on so many various disciplines and cross-disciplinary boundaries, because that's the world as it is not divided or siloed into different disciplines, right? We live in a social world that's impacted by so many variables, and so we think that to accurately study that world and think about it, it's really beneficial to use an interdisciplinary lens. So thinking about key concepts in gender studies, of course, one of the key ones that many of you, I'm sure, will already be familiar with is patriarchy. And literally, as you probably already know, literally the patriarchy means the rule or the law of the father, right? But it's also the system of formal and informal rules that structure our society to maintain men's dominant exercise of power and women's exclusion from that exercise of power. And so in this system, men or people who identify as male predominate in political leadership roles, moral authority, social privilege, and control of property. But of course, this system is, like all systems, dynamic and changeable and changing. And so therefore, when we talk about patriarchy as an overarching social system, we don't mean that it's infallible or impenetrable or unchangeable, or that it doesn't have many variations and disturbances within it. But it's something that we have to sort of start with as a kind of foundational idea that, of course, feminism and feminist theory is very concerned with challenging.
Okay, thank you. So building on what Dr. Hallet is saying, I'm going to tackle social constructionism, which could be, a lecture in and of itself. So I'll try to hone in on the central points. So just first of all, looking to the slide, I'll read what's on the slide and then elaborate. So under race, the power of an illusion, we have this description. So social categories such as race, sex, gender, disability, even the individual, are socially produced and not natural, right? And then turning over to the other picture, says, this is a quote from a really well-known feminist philosopher, Lorraine Code. Social constructionism offers the possibility of uncovering fundamental processes of patriarchal power in shaping our sense of ourselves and our world. So in other words, social constructionism tries to get at the idea that meaning and knowledge are socially constructed and depend on shared assumptions about the world. So race and gender are really good examples. Our ideas about race and gender are so often so ingrained that we feel that they're natural, whereas a social constructionist view would hold that they are conceptual categories that we create. Now, this is not to say that there is no material reality. That's sometimes something that people come push back at social constructionism with. It doesn't mean that there's no biology, for example, but it is to say that the meaning we attach to the material realities that we see to biology is a social creation. And I think Vicky will talk more about that as we get into other concepts. So, and this is another important point. So language is not neutral and becomes an important part of how we evaluate these social constructions. So how do we apply social constructionism in gender studies? Or put differently, how does the idea benefit women's and feminist movements and other movements? So Vicky, if you could go to the next slide. Mm-hmm. Here's where Simone de Beauvoir, who some of you might know, is really helpful. So probably the most famous quote from Simone de Beauvoir's writings is that one is not born but becomes a woman. Okay, and simply put, what that means is, what it means to be a woman is defined by a particular society at a particular time. And as de Beauvoir and other scholars have pointed out, in many societies, this definition, or what it means to be a woman, has been determined by patriarchal understandings, right, of the world, and which Vicky just discussed. So in this sense, there is a small p political agenda at work with this concept of woman or race or disability, right? So, and this is an interesting aside, many Indigenous feminists argue that colonialism sought to impose Eurocentric patriarchal definitions of womanhood onto Indigenous societies in North America. So my point here is that what it meant to be a woman, 200 years ago in another country, or even here on what we call Turtle Island, would have been something different than what it means today. And so the point is that if the idea of a woman or man or what have you, if these are social constructions, then they can also change. And that's the sort of hope, right, in understanding society in this way. Okay, thank you, Vicky.
All right, thanks so much, Carolyn. So another key concept that really sort of builds on what Carolyn is saying there is the concept of what we call intersectionality. And this is a term that was coined by Black feminist theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's really kind of a metaphor for the many ways that we try to understand and think about how systems of oppression act on people and groups differently depending on their locations at intersections of gender, race, socioeconomic class, sexuality, age, religion, etc. And so it's about, thinking through the ways that intersectionality, that intersectional social locations come to impact different groups differently. So when Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, was thinking about this, she was working as a lawyer, and she was thinking about the ways that women were trying to argue for racial discrimination at a car manufacturing plant. And she was representing them, and what she was finding was that people were responding to their claims by saying, well, women are employed at this plant, and so you can't be getting discriminated against because you're women. And there are other, Black men who are employed at this plant, and so therefore the discrimination can't be because of race. And she was saying, Kimberly Crenshaw was saying, well, these women are getting discriminated against because they are Black and women. And so they're facing this discrimination at this intersection. And that helped her, right? This idea of intersectionality helped her describe and so fight against this kind of discrimination. And so, this concept has become very, very key. And of course, she was building on the work of feminist theorists and activists before her as well, people like Angela Davis, who were talking about the ways that, social class, race, gender, all impacted on people and groups differently, right? So we can't think about, when we talk about patriarchy, that's one thing, but the way that filters down and impacts different groups of people will depend on where they're located and how many, different kinds of oppressions are intersecting in their lives, right? And so in the interest of time, there is a really quick video, but I think I'm going to move on because we're already at 1:24, so I don't want to take up too much time. And we can come back to that if people have questions, obviously. So another thing that's a really key aspect of what we think about and talk about in gender studies is what we call the gender spectrum. And to understand the gender spectrum, first we have to understand that our current model of gender is what's known as the gender binary. And so that means that, the most common or the most dominant understanding of gender is that, well, there are only two, right? Male, female, masculine, feminine, men, women are currently the most widespread and most widely understood and honored genders, right? When you look at most forms you have to fill in, whether those are government forms, application forms, etc., you will generally have to tick one of two boxes. That's the gender binary, essentially. And so these two genders are understood to be mutually exclusive and are only two options. So when babies are born, often the first question that gets asked is it a boy or a girl? That's the gender binary, right? And so as Carolyn talked about earlier with the whole idea of social construction, we're attaching meanings, right? We're attaching characteristics to body parts and labeling them as one or the other. And so a newer and developing model of gender is the gender spectrum, which holds that people can identify and experience themselves in a multitude of ways that do not necessarily map onto male or female, masculine or feminine. People can identify as a combination of masculine and feminine, as neither, and various spots in between. And so, the spectrum is also critiqued as a problematic model, but it's evolving. And one of the points that we have to make too, of course, is that, the language that we use is language that is always evolving, right? And so sometimes we feel like we can't keep up with the language that's changing and evolving. And we might all feel that way, but in gender studies, we're committed to always being challenging the dominant kinds of narratives that we hear, but also challenging ourselves and thinking about how we can do things in more equitable ways, and that includes how we use language. So we're all learning all the time. And so you might have seen this image that came up probably with some of the material that was used for promotion for this event. The gender unicorn is another thing that we can absolutely critique, but I think it's useful in explaining that gender has multiple aspects and is interconnected with sex and sexuality. And so you can see here from the graphic, it explains that gender identity is how you feel and think about yourself inside. Do you feel like the label boy makes sense for you, for example? And this is complicated. And of course, we think about how the labels of boys and girls are socially constructed as well. Gender expression is how you show your gender to the world. So how you dress, how you walk, how you sit, how you wear your hair, all the physical markers and ways of acting in the world that help people identify us or help people read the gender that we want them to read. And of course, sex assigned at birth is that question that gets answered, boy or girl, right? And sometimes that is indeterminable from people's external genitalia. And those babies are often labeled as intersex. And this can also be determined later in life from chromosomal makeup and other less visible properties in bodies. And intersex babies have in the past usually been labeled a boy or a girl, and then raised as one of those genders within the gender binary. And when surgery became a medical option, those babies were often surgically altered to better fit one or another gender. Today, there is a growing intersex support network and advocacy movement that calls for babies to not be automatically surgically altered if it's not medically necessary, and for intersex folks to be allowed to exist and live as they are and to have choice about whether or not to have any medical interventions later in their life. And of course, we're talking also about sexual and romantic attachments and attractions, which represent the directions that our desires take. And society generally labels us as having a sexuality based on our gender and the gender of the people that we desire. But it's quite complicated. And there are newly developing categories that try to capture the variation that exists in our worlds of sexual and romantic attachments. And so, again, this language is often evolving and changing. And, I think what's important to remember is that, having respect for and having an understanding that these things, that our gender identities and our ideas about gender are evolving and changing. And my one critique, I will put that in there really quickly, is that while I really do appreciate what this image is doing, sometimes I worry that the idea that it's a purple unicorn makes it seem like it's imaginary and not real. But all of our genders are deeply real for us and how we feel them. So I just want to point that out really quickly. All right, so moving on, applying the concepts, how we use these things and how we think about them in research and action. So Carolyn, I'm going to quickly go on and I'll come back to Carolyn in a moment, but this one is mine. The patriarchal dividend. So as you can see here, the patriarchal dividend is the advantage to men as a group for maintaining an unequal gender order. And money and income is only one kind of benefit. Others are authority, respect, service, safety, housing, access to institutional power, emotional support, and control over one's life. And I use the example of Nicole Powers' research. As a sociologist here at MUN, Dr. Powers studied the impacts of the Cod moratorium in 1992. And she found that despite the devastating impacts the closure had on entire communities, right, on the entire province, and the huge numbers of women who were also out of work, men still retained certain benefits, benefits that were attached to their, their position as fishermen, the legitimation that they had as fishermen. They had better access to resources for professionalization, retraining, et cetera, et cetera. And so the patriarchal dividend is, whether men want it or not, whether they ask for it or not, it generally accrues to all men. But of course, right, as we mentioned before, when it comes to intersectionality, that dividend will be different and mediated by groups of men's race, class, sexuality, age, et cetera, right? So it's an overarching concept, but of course it gets qualified and is contingent upon other things as well. Okay, and last one for me for a little while, hegemonic masculinity. So of course in gender studies, often people think that gender studies only studies women. And of course we study all genders. And one of the key concepts we work with is hegemonic masculinity. And so that is, according to theorist Raewyn Connell, the most honored way of being a man in any given culture, society, and or historical period. And as you can see here, right, it is one form of being a man. And this involves aspects of behaviors, appearances, cultural relevance, social belonging, and political and economic influence. And while, as Connell points out, it's not statistically prevalent, right? Not most men will not embody hegemonic masculinity, but those who do embody it will generally sort of exercise the greatest amount of power and benefit the most from the patriarchal dividend. But other forms of masculinity exist simultaneously and in relation to this form of masculinity. And that relationship can be one of acquiescence or appeasement or aspiration or opposition. I am not that, or it can be a combination of many things. But the point is that, there is not one singular form of masculinity any more than there's one singular form of femininity. There are often various combinations, and it's always impacted and exists in relation to and in combination with other aspects of identity as well. Okay, I'm going to stop talking for a moment. Turn it over to my colleague, Carolyn.
Okay, thank you so much. Another way that we apply these concepts is in terms of titles. So I'm sure some of you will remember the shift from Mrs. and Miss to Ms., a shift that has been memorialized in a sense by Ms. Magazine. You can see the memorial issue here from 2012, I believe. So Ms. Magazine was an insert in New York Magazine, and then it launched itself as an independent publication in 1972. So, honorifics continue to change, as we can see with MX, pronounced mix or mex. I looked it up. There's different ways that people pronounce it. And I'll just read from the slide. This word was added in September 2017 to the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. The gender-neutral mix is used as a title for those who do not identify as being of a particular gender, or for people who simply don't want to be identified by gender. Though the earliest print evidence dates to 1977, the word has only recently become popular. And I would give another example that some of you might have seen, which is Latinx, Latinx. Latino or Latina is a category used to refer to people of Latin American cultural or ethnic identity in the US. But in this case, Latinx, the X replaces the O or the A in Latina or Latino, which corresponds to grammatical gender in Spanish, making the word gender neutral. So go ahead to the next slide, please.
Okay, thanks.
And pronouns. So in this age of Zoom or the WebEx in this instance, you might have noticed that some people put their pronouns next to their names. And I would say that this shift, this reflects decades of LGBTQ activists working to get society to respect people's genders, right? And not to assume that you know someone's gender by their name or by how they look. And interestingly, there are many less known alternatives to the gender binary pronouns that we have, in addition to they or them, which is here in the picture. So, for example, some people want to refer to themselves as Z, that's spelled Z-E, or here, pronounced spelled H-I-R. And here's an example of how you might use those in a sentence. Z is a poet and wrote that poem, Here Self. Those ideas are here's. I like both here and here ideas. So, some people might use a gender neutral pronoun, even though they identify as a man or a woman. They just do not want to be identified by their gender. They don't want others to identify themselves by their gender. And, some people might have a different set of pronouns with different audiences, just like we have names that we use in some places, at some contexts, and special names that we use in other contexts. So, okay, go ahead to the next slide, please.
Okay, you bet.
Another way that these ideas are applied is around identification documents. So many of you may know Q'eqchiʼ. So I'll just read again from my friend Wikipedia. On December 14th, 2017, Hickey became the first person in Newfoundland and Labrador and one of the first in Canada to receive a non-binary birth certificate. Their application was initially rejected because the Vital Statistics Act limited gender designation on the application form to male and female only, those boxes that Vicky referred to. So that's it for me for now. Go ahead, Vicky.
Okay, thanks. So unfortunately, we're still talking about gender and sexual violence today. It hasn't gone away, of course. And, violence is enacted. We talk about gender and sexual violence as violence that's enacted against people because of their genders or sexual identities. And whether that's sexual violence, physical violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, economic violence, all of these are aspects of violence that we talk about. And it's perpetrated as an exercise of power and control and is interwoven with multiple axes of oppression. Again, right? Colonialism, racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia. And of course, as we've seen over the past year, violence in households has increased and rates of femicide in particular have risen. The Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability has just reported that 160 females were killed violently in 2020. And in 90% of those cases where a perpetrator was identified, the accused was male. And these reports, of course, coming out just in the last few days. And these stats don't even account for the numbers of LGBTQ2S folks who get killed and violently assaulted in disproportionate numbers due to their gender and or sexual identity as well. And of course, we have pictured here the hashtags MeToo and MMIWG2S, so missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. And these are movements that are ongoing to counteract this kind of violence. And we're all working towards a day when this is no longer an issue, but as we all know, progress can be glacially slow and frustrating, and progress unfortunately never moves in a straight line forward. It's always, there's all kinds of ways that we fall backwards and slide back too as well. And so, sadly, we are, this is Tarana Burke, of course. Sorry, I should identify Tarana Burke as the founder of the Me Too movement. I don't want to let that slip by. Of course, the No More Stolen Sisters movement is an Indigenous-led movement that is working to counteract and eliminate violence against Indigenous women and girls as well. And so we continue to hold vigils, like the December 6th vigil to honor the 14 women killed by an anti-feminist murderer in 1989 at Montreal's École Polytechnique. And we continue to have special days of remembrance for violence against Indigenous women and girls, trans folks, LGBTQ folks. We march in the streets. We try to take back the night to call out what is essentially terrorism, quite frankly, but is rarely labeled as such. We've seen recent movements in the UK, women marching in the streets there, women and all people of all genders marching in the streets to talk about the importance of violence. And, you know, why would I like to see this called terrorism? Well, because in Canada, the criminal code defines terrorism as an act committed in whole or in part for a political, religious, or ideological purpose, objective, or cause, with the intention of intimidating the public. And frankly, I kind of think gendered and sexual violence does intimidate the public, and keeps a large portion of that public in fear, and concerned about their movements and what they do on a regular basis. So language matters. So I will turn it back over to Lynne D'Arcangelis again to talk about another important aspect.
Thank you, Vicki. So many of you might have heard of this term, the she session, which as far as I know was coined recently since the pandemic, but I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So usually the interesting thing is that men are normally hit harder by recessions, but this time has been, you know, an exception. So why is this? I'm just going to read a quote because I think this says it succinctly, and it's from, I can cut and paste the link to the article. A lot of it comes down to childcare. Given the unique dynamics of the pandemic-induced recession, women have found themselves in jobs less suited to telecommuting, like department store cashiers, for example, and more likely to take on the burdens of childcare with schools and daycares closed. Mothers with young children reduce their hours, work hours that is, 4 to 5 times as much as fathers did. And, you know, of course, if we apply an intersection, or if we think intersectionally, you know, we'll realize that all women are not equal in this sense. And the she session has been worse for certain groups of women. And those groups include racialized women, such as Blacks, Hispanics, and also less educated women and younger adults. Yeah, I wanted to share some, well, anyway, I guess I won't. I wanted to share that that graphic, but can I take?
And we do that right now.
I guess we need, it'll just take a second, but it's an interesting visual. I think, can you give it to me, or does Janet give me the ball? We have to share the ball, you see.
Yes, we're bouncing this hypothetical ball back and forth, everyone, and we're figuring out how to do that as best we can.
Okay, you know what? Let's leave it for now. Maybe we'll come back to it. Okay.
Yeah, we get a chance.
Oh, I am the presenter. Okay, hold on. Let's see if we can do this now. Okay, so here I hope everyone can see the screen. It just shows the unemployment rate for different groups of women in November 2020, and you can see for all women, it was 6.1%. I think this is it from the States. But if you go to Gen Z women, so younger women, 10.1%, Black women, Hispanic women, women with less than a bachelor's degree. So you cannot look at these things without applying an intersectional lens. I guess that's really the point here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And okay, I think that's me for now.
Okay,
go ahead, Vicky.
Great, thanks. So what kinds of research are happening in our department? What kinds of organizing is happening? I'll give you a quick sense of that, even though well, we won't get a chance to get into that really heavily, but these are just some of the books that have been published in the last couple of years by faculty members. Sonia Boone's What the Oceans Remember, and of course Catherine Sides, Patching Peace on her research in Northern Ireland. Sonia Boone does also autoethnography and life writing research, and this is a fantastic book as well. There's mine. And so it just gives you sort of a sense of the diversity and breadth of the work that's getting done. And of course, people are publishing all kinds of articles and book chapters that deal with many different kinds of issues, and some of that can be found in the Democracy Cookbook, which had contributions from over 70 contributors, I think. And as you can see, 5 of them were from gender studies faculty. And of course, some of the organizing that's being done, Dr. D'Arcangelis has been deeply involved in this movement, Violence No More. Caroline, do you want to just speak to what you
Yeah, sure. I'm going to do this really quickly so we have just a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
So Violence No More is an event that I organized together with the First Light, what is now called First Light, and some other folks in Toronto. And we were really just trying to raise awareness about missing and murdered Indigenous women and the impending inquiry. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Vicki.
Okay.
Yeah, and then also, I think this was in 2017, we invited Loretta Ross, the Treaty Commissioner from Manitoba, to come and speak about reconciliation. You can go to the next, next slide. We had Dr. Kim Tallbear come to give the Henrietta Harvey Lecture in 2019, I believe. And I should mention that pretty much all of these events that we organize are done with other departments or other parts of the university. So it's always a collaboration, which I think is an important point. Okay, go ahead, Vicki. And then last year we had a few different events around this issue, Two-Spirit Trans Solidarity in an Age of Reconciliation. And go ahead, Vicki. And most recently, last week, as a matter of fact, we hosted 3 Black feminists who spoke about abolition. And yeah, that was really well attended, and maybe some of you were there. All right, well, that's it for us, I think. We're at the end of our presentation. Take it away, Janet.
Yes, thanks so much.
Hi, we're back.
Hi.
I'm going to make myself visible here so everyone can see me, and we're going to go right to the questions. It's going to be a rapid fire for questions, you guys. So we're going to start with, but first of all, sorry, before I get into that, I'd just like to thank you both. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure we've learned a lot, and again, we're going to go right into the questions. So Wendy Martin is asking, what do you suggest to assist positive change towards equality in a historical patriarchal organization? That's a tough one.
That's a big one. That's a big one. Okay, so I guess, one of the things that I will first suggest is to, look at what's worked. Do some research. What has worked in other organizations? What has been beneficial? How are people find like-minded people in your organization and work collaboratively in solidarity with them to address issues that are foundational and on the ground where you are. You haven't got to reinvent the wheel, right? There's been a lot of organizing that's happened in the past, and think about what works, what doesn't work, and then think about the particularities of your organization or your situation, and how you might alter that work and make it work for you. Carolyn, you're involved in solidarity work. Want to speak to that as well?
Really quickly, Carolyn.
I don't really have anything to add except that, you might have to do some direct action, which is, mucking up the works, right? And that usually gets people's attention. So,
okay. Okay, here's the second question from Sydney Burton. Gender spectrums are often depicted on a 2D line, masculinity at one end and femininity on the other. with an ability to slide in between. Is this depiction restrictive? Is it possible to have a 3D model that better represents intersectionality and fluidity?
Mhm.
I can
Yes.
address this. I was trying to look for the author, but I just read something recently about having, instead of these spectrums of identity, and this could apply for other identities as well, we could think of identities in terms of galaxies. So we can move around the galaxy, right? And, think of our gender in different ways at different points in time. And it also helps us understand the relationship between different kinds of identity. Because if you have spectrums, you have to crisscross. If you have a galaxy, then it's much more fluid. Anyway, I think that was Sydney Burton. I can get a hold of you and pass along that reference if you'd like.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question. I'm a cis homosexual male of Maghrebi descent, I think it is, and I'm curious to hear about the power of gender studies in a language that allows neutrality.
Mhm.
For example, French is a totally binary language, and that makes gender studies much less
Yeah.
inclusive.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Caroline. Yeah.
Oh, well, so I've heard people who speak Cree talk about this because Cree is a gender neutral language. And so, you can learn from these languages and learn what kind of worldviews come out of languages or ways of thinking, because that's what a language is, right? The ways of thinking that do not have a gender binary built in. So, yeah, so I would just say you could learn from other research on other languages in other places, like the Cree folks. Anyway, sorry, that was getting a little nervous here trying to get it all out.
No, there's a lot to answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question from Callista Burridge. How do we match use of new terminology with grammar standards? Another language question. For example, there was in Gemma Hickey's description referring to a single person, but there has historically been plural. I think that's a question you probably get a lot.
Mm-hmm. Okay, go ahead, Vicky. Go ahead.
We do. Yeah. I guess the short answer is language is always changing and evolving, right? And so we're just going to have to shift and change as well. So, language is both reflective of and productive of our society, right? So, there are grammarians who would say that, there can also be used as a singular pronoun, especially if you don't know someone's gender, you'll often refer to them as they. But, I think the most sort of concise answer is that we are shifting and changing our language, and language always does that. So we are growing as the language grows as well.
Great. Here's a comment, very interesting and eye-opening presentation. If an individual was interested in changing the thoughts and behaviors of others regarding gender equality and discrimination, where would you suggest the change start?
So if you want to change someone else's behavior, I mean, that's a tough one because there's so many ways. But one of the key things I think is to understand that in many ways the knowledge that we have is a privilege, and sharing that knowledge with people and meeting people where they are is really important. Because I think to assume that anyone who doesn't think exactly like us is fundamentally wrong or fundamentally sexist or fundamentally racist, or I think we need to try and meet people where they are and have conversations and make something like gender equity relevant to their life, right? Make them understand that all of us have an investment in equity, right? And so that's kind of the approach I take with people, because we see people from, all kinds of different walks of life and different levels of experience and knowledge come into our first level classroom, especially. And I don't find it helpful to say, you're a sexist and I'm going to change how you think. It's like, I'm going to try and offer you some ideas and ask you provocative questions and maybe help you develop new questions. And that's a place to start.
Yeah.
This is one piece.
Yeah. And Bell Hooks has a book, and now I'm going to mess up the title. I think it's called Feminism is for Everybody, and it's from like 2000, but it's really, it's still applicable, and it's very accessible, and I would say read that.
Yeah. We'll include that. We'll include some resources in a follow-up email.
Right.
So people have,
okay, great.
Good idea.
because we did have a question about any guides for using pronouns, but I think maybe we can include that in a follow-up.
Yes. Yeah,
Here's a
there are lots
question.
of guides. Yeah.
Kathy Bussey asked, why do you think society has fought so hard against anything other than a binary system for assigning sex?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I
That's
mean,
a
I
tough
think I'm
one.
going to defer to you for starters, Vicky, on this one.
Sure. Yeah, this is one that comes up in my genders and sexualities class a lot. And the way I kind of think about it is, I think about the binary of gender almost like as foundational pillars for a much larger system, right? So when you think about binary gender, man, woman, meet, have babies, nuclear family. Nuclear family is in another level of support for other gendered institutions, right, throughout our society, religious institutions, economic institutions, cultural institutions that are right through are built up on that. So those two pillars, that binary pillar is a support system, right? A foundational support system for these other structures. So like sort of like a house of cards, you start wobbling those foundations and suddenly, woo, the whole structure looks pretty shaky. And so most of us, right, are pretty invested in those larger structures, whether or not we realize it even, right? And so I think that fundamentally is part of the great resistance to changing that binary structure.
Yeah, I would just add that it's also a very it becomes very deeply personal, and it's someone's identity, and that it's very disorienting, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's
sorry.
Yeah.
Just
Go
to be
ahead,
clear,
Janet.
We're gonna have
the binary. Sorry, 1 minute. Okay, I just want to make clear that questioning the gender binary doesn't mean that it's wrong to identify as male or female or boy or girl. It's not about that, right? It's not saying, oh, those are bad identities. Not at all. It's just that it's saying that those are options among a galaxy of so many other options, right? Anyway.
We have time for one more question. So here's a question from Ann Colburn. How does the political polarization impact the ability of gender-based landmark studies to influence societal norms? More simply, how do we amplify this conversation in a political environment?
Yeah. I think, okay, quickly, I'll just say, I think we have to amplify it in any platform that we have. Wherever you find yourself, whatever position you are in, whatever lane you happen to be in, amplify it in that lane, and then it'll move outward from there. That's one tiny piece.
And when you say political environment, I would add that any environment can be political when you're talking about questions of power. So you don't need to wait until you feel like you're in a particular context. You can take it up, as Vicky suggested, at the dinner table, which can be tough. But I think also, as Vicky said, you meet people where they're at. Sorry, we leave that much time for questions. Talk.
But hey, come take a gender studies course.
That's right.
I'd love to see you and love to talk more about this. Don't be afraid. Come chat with us, and would love to have you.
Great. Well, listen, we even have more questions we didn't get a chance to get to. So
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll try maybe even to answer those questions in the follow-up, or reach out directly to Vicki or Dr. Hallet or Dr. D'Arcangelis, and I'm sure they're more than happy to respond. So we'll include their email addresses in the follow-up document. But I'd just like to thank Dr. D'Arcangelis and Dr. Hallet for their presentation and their time. I'm sure we've learned a lot today. I know I have. And thank you to all of you out there for attending and for your really great questions.
Yes, thanks everyone.
If you enjoyed today's event, our third HSS 101 session is going to be held on April the 20th at 1 p.m. and it will feature Dr. Jillian Gould discussing folklore. You can find the link to register on our alumni website. As indicated earlier, this session has been recorded, and I will be sharing a link in an upcoming email, so please keep an eye on your inbox. And I think we are completely out of time now. It's 2:01. So thanks again, everyone. And I am going to stop the meeting now. Thanks for attending, and we'll see
Thank
you
you.
at.
Thank you very much.